Y'all join us.
From my mother's womb, you have chosen me, and love has called my name. Sing it out. I'm born again to your family. Your blood flows through my veins. I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God.
Just think about those words. Sing out, whoa. God, we just thank you this morning. We thank you for that truth. We thank you for that word. Wow. What a powerful song. What a powerful message. Some of us this morning are bound in fear. We're bound on finances. We're bound by our future. We're bound by our family. We're bound by our faith, some of us. If somebody asked us about our faith, I think some of us would be frightened. And as we're going to look at this morning, we don't have to fear what other people fear, because I'm a child of God. In fact, if we do, it's the exact opposite of faith. God, thank you that we're no longer slaves of fear. In Jesus' name, amen. You can be seated. Peter chapter 3 this morning. 1 Peter chapter 3. A couple weeks ago, we dealt with Exodus chapter 4, and it was from the standpoint of Moses and what God had told him to do about going and setting the Israelites free, and Moses had fear. He had a tremendous amount of fear. I don't know if you have ever done it, but some things that God has asked me to do, I was afraid to do. It was not something that I just jumped out and said, yes, of course, Lord, I'll do that. No, it was like, God, are you sure you got the right person? Are you positive? And the other side of it is, God, I think you really are crazy. I thought you were last time, but this time I really think that you are. And you know what that is? That's being a slave to your fear. Because whoever you obey is your master. If you obey your flesh, then your flesh is your master. Amen. You are a slave of your flesh. If you can't get that under control, then there's a problem, and that's okay, because God says, hey, I'm here to help. It's not okay that we're a slave to anything, but from the standpoint that God gives us the grace to be able to face those things, to be able to face those issues. That's why we're here, because no one walked in perfect. You just walked in saved, right? You're a child of God, you walked in saved. You didn't walk in perfect. Now, on the other hand, Paul says, hey, don't use the grace as an excuse to keep doing what you want to do. Because that is, man, that's almost more dangerous.
That's right.
Because not only are you potentially not saved yourself, but now you're potentially hurting someone else that may need to see your testimony and your witness. And so it's a very dangerous spot to be. Actually, just look back. 1 Peter chapter 3. So we're going to talk about how do we stand up and speak up in the face of fear. What do we do to combat fear? How do we face it? How does it look? How do we attack fear? Because fear is something that if you are passive about, in other words, if you don't have a plan to deal with your fear is going to take control of you. Same thing with any kind of addiction or any kind of negative behavior, is that if you, like in a marriage or whatever, if you don't have a certain plan to defeat what you're facing, then you're going to be defeated. You got to have a plan. The old quote is, if you fail to plan, plan to fail. That's right. That's right. And I think that that's appropriate for what we're looking at. 1 Peter 3, if we could back up to verse 13, I don't know if that's possible with all the craziness in this computer here. We're going to read out of the Holman Christian this morning. Holman Christian Standard. I grew up on the King James. I'm partial to it. But some of the newer translations are a little bit easier to understand and go through. So that's our approach this morning. Verse number 13, you can just read along in yours. It's kind of good that we don't have screens because, good job. It's kind of good that we don't have screens sometimes because you can actually look at your own Bible and bring your Bible and mark it up. It's hard to mark up a phone. You can do it, like you can create notes and stuff, so that's kind of cool. And I'm sort of in between. I grew up and my dad got his first computer, when I was a kid, and I remember that. And we had like that one game where the ball went from one side of the screen to the other. Yes, Pong. That one. And I remember just sitting there at the screen like, just watching that thing. And now it's like, kids wouldn't play that for 5 minutes now, It's a different time. So anyway, 1 Peter 3, verse number 13. And who will harm you or mistreat you or do evil to you if you are passionate for what is good? That is such a good little phrase right there. We may come back to that in a minute. Who will harm you if you are passionate for what is good? But even if you should suffer from doing right or righteousness, righteousness is a big churchy word, and it just means doing right and being right. Doing right because you're saved, and being right because Jesus has died and we accepted him into our heart, and so we're right in God's sight. All right? So righteousness, don't be intimidated by some of that stuff, all right? But even if you should suffer for doing right, you are blessed. Now that's a contradiction, isn't it? How can you be blessed and suffer at the same time? We'll come back to that. But even if you should suffer for righteousness, you are blessed. Now that is counterintuitive. That makes my mind hurt a little bit. But it says, do not fear what they fear or be disturbed. Who is they?
Those who aren't righteous in the world.
Okay, the world, the unsaved, the people. God is, Peter is speaking to a group here, and the Holy Spirit is giving him the inspiration for it, and he's speaking to the group of righteous people, to the saved people, and he's saying, don't fear what the people that are not saved fear. It's a dangerous trap. Facebook and social media, some of these things are awesome outlets for reaching people and advertisement and speaking to people's lives and so on, but it's very, very dangerous because we fall into the trap of believing what Facebook and social media says about us is true.
That's right.
And what God says about you as a child of God is the truth.
That's right.
It's not just true, but it's the truth. Just because something is true does not mean it's the truth. And you got to be careful with that. Do not fear what they fear or be disturbed. Verse number 15. But set apart the Messiah as Lord in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. However, in this, when you are giving a defense of your faith, when you're given an answer for why you do what you do and believe what you believe, this is what Peter is instructing us to do. Do this with gentleness and respect, keeping your conscience clear. This is so important. Because even if there are some people that are very courageous and very bold and not ashamed to speak of their faith and tell, their testimony and so on, but if it doesn't come within the context of respect and gentleness, then you've lost it. You've lost it. So do this with gentleness and respect, keeping your conscience clear, so that when you are accused, those who denounce your Christian life will be put to shame. So if you didn't do it, the problem with not doing it with gentleness and respect is that if they come back against you, the first thing they're going to look at is how they were treated. Were they treated with respect, and was there a spirit of gentleness that you approached them with? Because that's the first thing that people see is the exterior. The exterior is what Peter is talking about. He's saying the outside is what everybody looks at first, especially those who are non-Christians. Everybody looks at the outside, but in earlier in the Bible, in Samuel, it says, but the Lord looks at the heart. So a saved person, God teaches us to look at somebody's heart and look at their motive, right? Because sometimes people's way of doing things isn't the best, and we still got to maintain a positive look at it. It's not what you say, but how you say it. But as a Christian, we're really instructed to look at how they say it and what they say. Because if you respond to someone the way that they roughly responded to you, then you're no better than them.
That's right.
In fact, it's worse because you're supposed to be doing this with a clear conscience. For it is, verse 17 says, "For it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than doing evil." Like David said, it's better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. So what Peter is saying is it's better to have to go through some things as a Christian, even if you're going through a lot, okay? Anybody ever got saved and then right away they faced attacks, like immediately? Like, whoa, like, man, maybe I shouldn't have done this, right? And Peter is telling these Christians, because a lot of these Christians are going through this. They get saved, and not only are they going through a rough demonic sort of influence, but guess what? They're getting hunted down and captured and beheaded and so on. Put in jail, put in prison, beat up. That's what they're facing. Sometimes we get a little babyish, you know, with what we're facing compared to what not only did they face back then, but in other parts of the world, they're facing right now. Now, here's the thing, though. Let's bring it back to us, is that what's tough for you is tough for you. I can't say, well, I've had it tougher, so your situation is nothing. Because I belittle you at that point. And I place judgment in a situation that I'm not in. So as Christians, we've got to be really, really careful with how we approach it, because we end up putting, you know, and I've said this lots of times before, but we put our expectations on other people. And I do it all the time. We do, like in marriage and close relationships are the easiest to do that. What you expect for yourself, you demand from your significant other or your friend or your son or your daughter. And that creates a little bit of a rub there. Because a personal right is a rule that you've made up for yourself that you expect someone else to obey. That's called a personal right. And in relationships, it's that we share personal responsibility. So we're both in this together. So the idea of stand up and speak up is so pertinent here, because this not only tells you that you should stand up for righteousness and speak up for righteousness. What do I mean by that? I mean, what do you stand for? I heard a statement once that said, I'm sure some of you can quote it, but
If you stand for nothing, you fall for anything.
yeah, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything.
That's right.
And that is so true, because what do you stand on? I stand upon the word of God, the B-L-B-L-E, Bible! Remember we used to shout that when we were kids? I love that old song. I love all them old songs. I love all songs, actually. I pretty much like songs.
Good thing.
But them old, yeah, good thing. Kind of works out, doesn't it? But I like them old songs because they're simple and they teach us what we're supposed to do as adults. The B-I-B-L-E, yes, that's the book for me. I stand upon the word of God, the B-I-B-L-E. Bible! That teaches us what we're supposed to do as adults. That's the point of children's and youth and so on, is that we learn how to act when we become mature.
Amen.
But there's a little gap. Because Paul said, when love gets grown up, in 1 Corinthians 13, you can read the whole chapter. It's called the love chapter, right? And they always read it at weddings, and it's appropriate. But it's dealing with Christians and their maturity. The love is the fruit of the Spirit that you and I are supposed to have as Christians. As we develop and grow, our love develops and grows. Well, at the end of that chapter, it says, when I was a child, I spoke and thought and acted like a child. But when I became a man, he said, I put away childish things. And the picture there is that when he grew up, the things that he used to do, that he thought was love is not really love. So he's saying that if we don't have love one to another, if we don't love God and love others, then you are still a childlike Christian, a childish Christian, should I say. And at some point, that fruit inside of us must develop. So, stand up. Stand up for something. What do you stand for? Do you know what you really stand for? What is it that you stand for? Because all of us would stand up if the president came in here. And all of us stood up when East Central was in state. Well, that catered. Or Alabama, or how about our long-lost friend, or, we see a child or a mother or father after a long while. We stand up for that. But yet the important things, we don't rank them in our priority as important, and we don't stand for those things. And if you don't stand, you'll never speak to it, because you only speak of what you believe. You don't speak something that you don't believe. And if you do, it's superficial speech, it's surface speech, but you don't really believe it. In other words, if you're not doing what you're saying, then you don't really believe what you're saying. So there's a link there between standing up and speaking up. And someone that's very effective in their speech and in their approach and in their life, they will really nail down what it is that they believe and what it is that they cling to. What is valuable to you? What do you rank as important in your life? God, family, and then everything else, right? I mean, that's pretty standard. That's a standard issue. Love God, love others. So there's a spiritual aspect, a social aspect, and then everything else is in direct correlation to how you are spiritually and how you are socially. If our spiritual relationship is off, then guess what? You're going to have fights with your family members, and you're going to have fights with friends, and you're going to wonder, why can I not get along? Why is there always conflict? Why is there always this battle and this butting of heads, and why can't we get this right? It's because there's no spiritual foundation. You've not stood for Jesus in your hearts. You haven't made God Lord in your heart. And so if we read this text, it says, who will harm you if you are passionate for what is good? He's like, hey, do what's good. It can only help. Right? But even if you should suffer for righteousness, you are blessed. Now that is a weird thing to think about. How can it say that we suffer and we're blessed at the same time? Blessed means happiness repeatedly, over and over again. To be blessed, you ever hear somebody, how you doing? I'm blessed. Ever heard that person? That's like all they say. Not like it's a nice day or anything. It's just, I'm blessed. It's almost like it's just a habit, But some people really can say, hey, I'm blessed. I'm doing really well. And the word blessed means happiness over and over and over again. And how do you obtain that? It's by having the joy of the Lord in your heart. Now, joy is not an activity. Joy is something that we choose to partake in. Joy is something that I have a relationship with God, and He gives me the grace to have a positive outlook, and everything I give thanks, and so therefore I have a joy and a hope. The basis of joy is hope. For a person that has no hope, you're going to see that they don't have much joy. And here's the thing, joy produces happiness repeatedly. Right? So even if we suffer, even if we're going through a difficult time or the eye of the storm, we can be blessed. Why? Because we're in a relationship with God, we have a positive outlook, and the Holy Spirit gives us the grace to be able to have happiness in the midst of tough times.
And that's why we're blessed. And then he follows up with the sort of the backup to what he just said. He said, how can you suffer and be blessed at the same time? And this is why. Because he says, do not fear what they fear or be disturbed. The reason that we struggle, when we struggle, the reason that we struggle is that we're crippled, we're slaves of fear. We are slaves of fear. And how can we move? You ever been in your room or your house or something like that, and maybe you're in bed and you wake up and you're just afraid. You're just crippled with fear. Like you wake up maybe as a kid or even as an adult. I've had that happen before as an adult. It's a weird feeling. But I wake up and all of a sudden I'm just scared. There's no reason, no rhyme, no reason. I'm just scared. And what do? Nothing, because I can't move. I'm frozen with fear. Ever been like that maybe in real life where you're so afraid you can't even move? Maybe you've been in a real dangerous situation. Maybe it's just for an instant that you're afraid that fear has got you for just a second. But the moral of the story is that fear causes paralysis. True fear, when you're really, 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 really scared, it causes you to freeze up. I'll give you an example. I was staying at a friend's. This was just a couple years ago. And actually, I was supposed to preach the next day. And I woke up about 2 o'clock in the morning. I was actually sleeping in the living room on the floor on a pallet. And the dog was there with me, and she had laid down. Well, I wake up wide awake, and I have this crazy feeling of fear. I can't even move. I am so scared. Not in my mind I'm scared, I'm just I can't move. I am terrified. I look at the dog, and the dog is not sleeping. It's sitting up, and it's turning its head at the door like it's watching something. And I'm okay, I'm really freaked out now. So what did I do? Nothing. I prayed. Because I couldn't move. I was so scared. And after a minute or two of praying, it lifted, and I went outside to look, and I'm man, that's crazy. And for that dog to be up in the middle of the night, staring at the door, looking, that was fearful. I was afraid. And I couldn't move. If something was there, I was done. It would have got me. There's only a few times in my life that I've ever been that scared where I just couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. And that's the picture here. What he's saying is if you want to be blessed in the middle of tough times, if you want happiness to continue in your life, then you cannot be paralyzed with fear. And not only that, but it says don't fear what they fear. So it's one thing to be afraid of the boogeyman or whatever that was that dog was looking at the other day. It's one thing to be afraid of that. But it's another thing to be afraid of your future, of your finances, of your family situation. That's a whole other ball of wax, isn't it? And that's the stuff that God is saying through Peter. He's saying, look, if you want to make it in tough times, if you want to allow happiness and that blessed approach to your life, if you want that for your life, it's saying don't fear what the world fears. And why that is because the thing that the world does not have is they don't have God to depend on in the midst of the struggle, in the midst of the suffering. And the reason that we get afraid, guys, in the middle of those times is because our brain is paralyzed, so to speak, and we don't think that, hey, we have this awesome God that we can rely on, and that we can reach out to, and that we can pray to. When you have a tough situation, is your first instinct, oh, Jesus? Not like, oh my God, but, oh my God, help me. That's the kind of approach that he's saying. The word afraid means to be alarmed, or trembled, or struck, or frozen with terror. That's what the word here that he used in Peter. It says, do not be frozen in terror. But here's the thing. This is the other side of this. This word can also mean to be in awe or reverence. So he's not only saying, don't be afraid of the stuff that the world's afraid of, because we have a big, awesome God that can handle that stuff, right? But the other side of it is he's saying, don't be in awe, don't reverence or respect the same things that the world respects. Right? It's called idolatry. That's the big fancy word for it. But what happens when you reverence something other than God is that you have placed something before God. And God is hindered in that approach, because whatever you put on the top is what's going to be active in your life. That's what you're going to stand for, and then that's what you're going to say and do. You can do nothing that you don't think about. Everything that you think potentially can become an action. Fear is based on lies. An unhealthy fear is based on lies. It's called lie-based thinking. The problem is we believe it to be true. That's why it says, study to show thyself approved. It also says that the Word of God is useful for reproof, correction, teaching, and training in righteousness. Training in right living. How can we be trained and taught to have the right approach and not believe the lies? If we are slaves of fear, then that means we believe the lie that the enemy has spun. But even worse than that, it means that we don't know the Word enough to actually believe it. That's the danger with fear, guys. It's not just, yeah, I have some fears that I need to deal with. No, if you don't deal with that thing, it's going to ruin you, ruin your testimony, and everything that you love and respect, it will take it. Same with addiction, same with anything. Fear is essentially an addiction. That's the problem with addiction, is that you believe in it more than you believe in God. That's the truth. And we approach life with a lie as our basis for operation as opposed to the truth. He said, don't fear that stuff. But then he said, set apart the Messiah. Now this is interesting. In the King James, the old King James, some people say that's the only translation there.
Amen.
Mr. Brad, but that is a translation of a translation as well. So, hey, what's the best version?
The one you read.
The one you read. Good job, guys. Great. Well, I can skip that part. Let's see. Let me go. Not this good. That wasn't it. But the word set apart means to sanctify. And this is very interesting, and I don't want y'all to miss this. The word sanctify means to make holy. So it's saying sanctify the Lord, set apart the Lord, the Messiah, as Lord in your heart. Now that is a mouthful. The word Messiah there is Christos. Si Cristo llama. That's Spanish. Yes, Jesus loves me. For all of you, a multitude of Spanish speaking here. But it says, set apart the Messiah as Lord. The word Christo means the chosen one, the Messiah, as it's translated. It means the one that was chosen to set us free, essentially. The chosen one. And what he's saying there is make holy, set apart, the Messiah, the chosen one, Jesus. Make sure that you take him and you set him apart from everything else. You take God, and I'm just giving you a visual, but you take Jesus, the chosen one, and you set him on the top shelf and you say, he is Lord. The top shelf of your heart. He is the top shelf. You ever heard the term top shelf? It means the best of the best. That's the idea here, is to take Jesus. Now this is a visual aid, not, but take Jesus and set him apart from everything else. The word apart means not part. Means not, and part means part. So the phrase set apart means to place as not a part. To place as not a part. Now what in the world does that mean? How do we place as not a part? How do we place Jesus as not a part? Here's the word though. The word sanctify or set apart means to determine something as common, as ordinary. So what he's saying is take Jesus and you determine in your heart that he's not common, that he's not ordinary, and you take him and you put him on the highest place of your heart. That's what he's saying. Because if you consider Jesus as common, you won't reverence him, you won't worship him, you won't come to church and be ready to worship or worship, much less. You won't be active in God's church. You won't be active in pursuing things of God and sharing your faith and growing your children up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Those things will not happen. Why? Because Jesus is common. He's not supernatural, right? He's not above. That's what the word super means. Supernatural, it means above the common or above the natural. So what will happen here if you want to be blessed in the midst of tough times, in the midst of life in general? I mean, this is life we're talking about here. First of all, you can't fear what they fear. And then secondly, you make Jesus as not a part of everything else. If he's a part of everything else, then he's not special. If I had 3 other girlfriends, that would probably make my wife upset, right? Why? Why would it make her mad? That's silly to get mad about. Because she's not special. She's not set apart. She's not part of them. She's different than everybody else. That's my declaration to her when you date, and essentially when you get married. You're saying, you are not common. You are not a part of everybody else. I am placing you as different, as above common. You're not common. You're not ordinary. You're the best, baby. Didn't know I was going to have some of you in there, huh? Merry Christmas. That's how you're kidding. No, really. But if I were to have 3 or 4 other girlfriends, even one, that would prove that she is part of this common mess. This harem of the Middle Eastern. My name would be Naboo. That's how they do it. But that's not what Jesus said to do. So that's the problem with making Jesus. Is he ordinary? Is he common to you? That's the question.
No.
That's our speech. Our speech is no, especially in the midst of believers. That's an easy thing to shout out, isn't it? To some people, not everybody, right? If you can't do it in the midst of Christians, you certainly won't do it in the midst of non. Why? Because Jesus is a part of everything else. He's common. So when Peter says set apart, he's saying you better draw a line and decide that Jesus is common or he's not. He said either way, that's up to you. As for you and your house, you decide what you will do at your house. But like Joshua said, as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. And he's going to be on the top shelf, and he's not common, and he's above the natural, and he is not ordinary. And I'm going to stand up, and I'm going to speak up, because that's how I believe. And you will not stand, and you will not speak to something that you don't believe. So the proof's in the hood. Hood. Right? But then he goes down and he says, set apart and be ready. Always be ready as our last one. Now this is interesting. The word ready, this is middle of 15. But set apart the Messiah as Lord in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope. Remember I said the joy is based in hope. Because all of this stuff comes down to that bottom line of having hope. The people that you find in rehabs and jails and homeless and so on, and some of our churches, unfortunately, folks in suicide situations and addiction situations, mostly it's a hope problem. There's no hope. A person that's lost hope, they have no capacity for anything else. Hope. Hope. So I guess a part of the question would be, do you have hope? Because I think that that's something that we need to deal with, first of all, because if there's anybody here that doesn't have hope, I want to tell you that there's hope. There's hope for the people. Hope. Hope. I'm going to tell you, I had a point in my life where I did not have hope. Some of y'all can speak to that. In January, about 17 degrees, I don't know how very cold. Snowing, ice. I broke into my brother's abandoned house to sleep on the floor with no furniture, no blanket, no nothing. Just so I could have a place to stay. I had to fight a raccoon just to get up the stairs. They're not very nice. I'll tell you that. Once I finally got them out of the way, I had to break off a branch and stab them and stuff. And then I felt bad because it was my brother's house. And it was like a really junky, like in the ghetto type house. And I had to pop the lock and then go lay on the floor. And it's like, that is pretty hopeless. And to be now where I'm at, where the Lord has brought me to and from, that's what this is all about. So I'm going to tell you, if there's anybody here that does not have hope today, I'm going to tell you that there's hope. That God can take the worst of the worst and make it better. He can take the worst of brokenness and heartbreak and he can heal it. He can take the most damaging of marriage situations and he can restore that thing. He can take the person that has given up on anything in their life, because that's at me at 25, I didn't think God could ever use me. I really didn't. I mean, after all the stuff I've been through and done, I thought that God had just like, I'm done. I really did, because I mean, everybody else in my life did, except for my dad, my sister. Who can you give hope? Because we can do all kinds of jumping around and hooping and hollering and all of this. But I promise you, when you walk out there, there's somebody that needs hope. You may be sitting next to them this morning. You may have thought of them when I was speaking on it, and you already knew, bam, I need to touch base with them because they need to know. Even if they don't believe it, and even if they say whatever or tune you out, it doesn't matter because you're planting a seed. You're telling them, hey, in Jesus' name, there is hope. It says always be ready. The word ready means to be fit. It means to be in shape. It's as an athlete who's preparing for an Olympic trial or game. That's what the word ready means. To be fit. To be physically, spiritually, in this case, spiritually and emotionally fit. Always be ready to give an answer. The word answer is apologia. We get our word apology from it. It's not like you're saying, I'm sorry. It's an answer, a criminal or civil defense. It's a statement that you give to clear yourself of confusion, guilt, chaos, or concern. Always be ready to have a response, to have an answer. Another word is a defense. Why do you believe what you believe? It's one thing to believe something. It's another thing to know why it is that you believe that thing. Why is it? Have you ever thought about that? Why is it that you really believe in God? Or do you? I think you should challenge that. I think you should challenge that within you. Because I think what you're going to find at the end of all your searching is that God's right there waiting. Because He is the way, the truth, and the life. Always be ready to give a defense or an answer for the reason of the hope. You know what the word reason is? And this is interesting. I've spoke this before. The word reason is logos. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was God, and the Logos was with God. John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. The word God, the word for the Word, in the beginning, Jesus is the Word. You know what that word that John 1:1 he uses right there? Is Logos. In the beginning was Jesus. The Logos. And right here, what is he saying? He's saying, always be ready to give a defense to anyone who asks you for the Christ, for the reason. In other words, Christ is the reason to which we have our hope. Amen. Always be ready. And do this with gentleness, respect, so that you can have a clear conscience. The word gentleness, and we're going to finish up right here. The word gentleness is also used, the word meekness. And that is grace of the soul. Gentleness does not mean that you're just patting everybody on their little bottoms. Gentleness means that I have grace of the soul, meaning that I am fully a participant in what God wants me to do. That's what the word gentleness, the word praeotis, is an idea of a soldier getting on his knee before his commander. It's as though a servant is getting before his master. It's though a person in the kingdom is coming before the king with his head bowed low and his hands held high in surrender. That's the word praeotis. So when you give an answer, you're to do it with gentleness, meaning you're to be on your knees before God. And you're to be humble and respectful when you talk to anybody else. Because if you mock the name of Jesus, that's a terrible, terrible blow. And we do that with our attitude. Because remember, the world can only see your attitude. It says, man looks on the outside, but God looks on the heart. And when we have a rotten attitude, guess what? That's how we're perceived and that's how we're responded to. So always be ready. Don't fear. Make sure that God is not common, that He's not a part of everything else. God needs to be separate. He needs to be holy. To make holy means to set apart, to make different. And then always be ready to give an answer. For the reason, Christ is our reason, for the hope that lies within you. I'm going to tell you there's hope. There's hope in Jesus' name. You no longer have to be a slave of fear. Praise team, if you come